Hi everyone. By now most of you will have just about finished assignment 1A, so I thought I'd take this opportunity to just go through with you all of the things that you should be checking for before you finally submit your folio. So in section 1 you were required to identify a need for both Harper and Madison. So one of the first things you need to double check is that you've chosen a different need for each student. If you choose the same need for each student, you're not going to demonstrate a wider depth of understanding for this folio. So make sure you've got a different need for Harper and Madison. The next thing you need to look at is this need specific? Now, we identified some broad needs for you, but you need to be very specific about the need that you're addressing for each of these students. So look at their writing sample, and if, for example, you've decided that punctuation is a need for one of them, which aspect of punctuation are you going to address? Punctuation is a pretty broad area and you can't possibly cover it in one learning experience. So be specific. It might be just full stops. It might be capital letters. Be specific. And have you, in your folio, analysed the writing sample and found explicit examples of the need? We need to see this in your folio. So in your first part of your folio where you are identifying the need, actually include examples from the writing sample to show that you have identified that specific need. The next part of section 1 is identifying a writing strategy for both Harper and Madison. Now remember, the writing strategies are model writing, shared writing, interactive writing, guided writing, independent writing, or the learning experience approach. So you need to have chosen one of those as the strategy you're going to use for Harper and Madison, but you need to choose a different strategy for each student. So if you pick modelled writing for Harper, then you're going to need to pick a different strategy for Madison. If you don't do this, you won't be able to do section 2 where you have to compare the strategies. Now, have a look. Have you actually described the strategy? So you need to give a very brief description of what the strategy involves. So tell us what model writing looks like, for example, or tell us what a guided writing session would look like. And have you explained how that strategy will address the identified need for each student? The important thing in this folio is that you link everything together. They all have to match. So you've identified the need. Now you have to explain how the strategy you've chosen will address that need. And in this section, it's really important that you've included appropriate academic support. Now, your starting point for this, of course, will be our eText Fellows and Oakley, but for higher marks, you need to actually read more widely. So try and have a range of appropriate academic support. Have you devised a learning activity for each student? So this is where you now implement your writing strategy in a learning activity addressing that need that you've identified. So does the learning activity that you've now devised include the teaching strategy? So if you said that you were going to use the modelled writing teaching strategy, your learning activity will be a modelled writing session. You need to make sure they link together. And then the other thing it has to link with, of course, is that the learning activity has to address the identified need for the student. So you have to show that your learning activity specifically addresses the need that you identified earlier. So going back to our earlier example, if you identified full stops as the identified need for one of the students, then the learning activity that you're going to be doing will be all about full stops. Then you have to describe the teaching methods. So have you included the teaching methods? Remember, these are things like scaffolding, modelling, open-ended questioning. So make sure that you've described the teaching methods that your learning activity includes. Remember, you have to also include some ICT that will enhance the learning experience and is relevant to the need. So this could be during the actual writing strategy. If you were doing modelled writing, for example, you might be using the interactive whiteboard, but you have to say how this is actually relevant to the need and how it will enhance the learning experience. Another option might be that you could find a great little resource activity that the students can do as a follow-up to the actual part of the learning experience that included the strategy. And the other important thing to do here in this section is to make sure you've made specific links to the year level content from the English curriculum. Now, these students were identified as Year 2 students, so that will be your first area to look at. So you'll be looking at the Year 2 content in either the Australian curriculum or your state's curriculum. You can use either. Look at the content descriptors there and try and match some content to the learning need that you've identified. Now, you might find that for one of these students, or for both, you might even look in Year 1 or you might look in Year 3, because in any given classroom you're going to be working at least 3 different year levels in terms of the curriculum. So sometimes you'll need to look back, sometimes you'll need to look forward, but try to find at least one content descriptor for each student from the English curriculum. Now, moving on to section 2, this is where you compare your teaching strategies. Remember, the strategies are modelled, shared, interactive, guided, independent, or language experience approach. So this is where you're going to be comparing the 2 that you identified earlier. So the first thing you need to do there is identify any similarities between these strategies. What are the similarities? And then, have you identified any differences between these strategies? So what's the same about them? What's different about them? Then for each of the strategies, you're going to have to identify some benefits and some limitations. So if you were doing modelled writing, you would identify, for one of the students, you would identify some benefits of modelled writing and some limitations of modelled writing. Now, it's very important that in this section you don't start going back to comparing the learning needs of the students. The needs of the students and the actual students themselves don't need to come into this section at all. Here you're just comparing the teaching strategies. You're just looking at the way these teaching strategies work. With your limitations, have you discussed how these limitations could be addressed in the classroom? So you might have identified that there's something that can be difficult about that strategy in a classroom situation. How could that be addressed? And then also in this section you're going to need to include some appropriate academic support. Remember, the more different academic support you include, the better your chances of getting a higher mark. And then finally, these are the last 2 criteria of our marking rubric, is the use of English and APA. So first of all, check that your folio is formatted correctly. In this case, we just want some simple subheadings. So you'd have section 1, you'd have Harper, and then Harper's needs and strategy and learning activity. Then you'd have Madison, same for her. And then finally section 2, the comparison. Just in paragraphs, so no dot points, no tables. We want this all in paragraphs. Have you proofread your work carefully for spelling and grammar errors? There's some very easy marks to be made in these sections of the marking rubric. So if you've proofread your work and made sure there are no spelling and grammar errors, that's some good marks for you. Have you used a formal academic tone and written in third person? Try not to slip into the I's and we's and they's. This is a formal folio, so it must be written in third person, and don't use too casual language. Keep it a nice academic tone. Have you cited all your academic sources? So remember, you need to cite them in text as well as the end reference list. And when you're doing that, have you used APA referencing conventions? And remember, there are links to these referencing conventions in our Padlet. In fact, the Padlet has lots of information about this for this assignment. Please go back and double check in there as well. All right, well, good luck everyone. I'm really looking forward to seeing your folios next week. I hope this has been helpful, and I'll see you all on the discussion board.